So I'm going to introduce our awesome panel. First of all, I want to let you all know that you should keep putting in those comments, put them in the Q&A. If we're able to answer them during the panel, then you might see some answers, but we will have a Q&A section at the end where we'll address as many of your questions as we can. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Shoshana Cordova, and I'll be the host of our panel today. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Datarails, which is a financial planning and analysis platform for Excel users. Welcome, and we are very happy to have you here. Next, we've got Tasha Tolliver. Hi, Tasha.
Hi.
Tasha is a Senior Finance Manager for Corporate FP&A at the Fortune 500 company Tenneco, which is an automotive components manufacturer. Tasha is based in the Chicago area and has previous FP&A and corporate finance experience at companies including the water treatment company Culligan Water, medical waste removal and treatment company Stericycle, and medical devices and healthcare company Abbott Laboratories. Tasha, we're so happy you could join the panel.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. And we've got Christian Wattig. Hi, Christian.
Hey, Shoshana.
Christian grew up in Germany and moved to New York City in 2013. He has held FP&A and finance leadership roles at Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and Squarespace. You may have heard of one or two of those. And at the same time, he also discovered his passion for teaching. He led the learning and development team at Unilever and now runs his own course called FP&A Bootcamp, which teaches financial planning and analysis skills to finance teams and business leaders. And most recently, Christian has also joined us here at Datarails as an FP&A solution architect. Welcome, Tasha and Christian. We're really happy to have you here. And before we jump into the questions, I have a question for the audience. I want to launch a poll because this is a bit of a conversation, and we want to hear what you guys have to say as well. So I'm going to launch our first poll. Okay, I'm going to give everybody a minute to answer. Why do you think FP&A is important? And then we'll move on to what Christian and Tasha have to say about that. Great, I see that half of you have answered. I'll give it another few seconds so the rest of you can answer the question. And this is, you can pick as multiple options here. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in a couple seconds. And closing the poll. Let's see what the results were. Okay, we've got 57% said we need to model different scenarios to make more informed decisions. But we've also got another very close leader. We need better budgeting and forecasting to allocate funds where they'll make the most impact. So we've got scenario modeling and budgeting and forecasting are the winners here. But all of them, all of these are hitting home. I can see that. Okay. And now let's see what the panelists have to say. So for the first question, before we get to the question, I just want to share this. We want to know why you think financial planning and analysis is so important for business growth. But before you answer that, I just want to point out that Datarails recently conducted a study with two professors from the University of Baltimore's Merrick School of Business. And we asked, we wanted to find out what was the economic impact of FP&A. And what we actually saw was that $7.8 billion of economic value in the US alone is lost each year due to inefficient financial planning and analysis processes. So now to you guys, Christian and Tasha, why is financial planning and analysis so important for business growth? Why is not doing it right making us lose $7.8 billion of economic value? And can you give an example where you saw firsthand the impact of FP&A on a company that you're working at? Tasha, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Resources are scarce. right? Everyone at any company is vying for their piece of the pie. And it's very important to know where we're spending money so that we can make strategic choices about how to allocate, new money for new technology or R&D or hiring additional people, because you can't, it's hard to grow if you don't have enough people, the right technology, et cetera. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say that I joined a company some time ago where there was no professional FP&A process being conducted at all, mostly because this company was in a major growth phase for many, many years. And so, they always met or exceeded their guidance. And so I think, they didn't necessarily see the importance of it because they just couldn't lose for a long stretch of years. And it wasn't until they saw that growth begin to pull back that they decided it is time to have a professional FP&A staff here full time. And certainly it took years. It doesn't happen overnight. But, they're finally at a place now where when they give guidance, they can be sure that they'll meet or exceed their guidance again after a very unfortunate stretch of either not, meeting or just barely meeting guidance.
Okay, so it sounds like FP&A is here for the long game, and companies that don't realize that are gonna lose out. If they're just seeing growth and they feel like they don't need it, then they're gonna see the consequences of that.
Exactly.
What about you, Christian? What was your experience?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know this, FP&A is the team in a company that manages the forecast, the budget, and they do financial analysis to help business leaders make better investment decisions, right?
Yeah, thanks for spelling that out, Christian. Laying the groundwork,
Sure.
awesome. Yeah.
Sure. So when FP&A is implemented well, the team can connect the dots between departments and can sometimes be a bit siloed, right? And great FP&A leaders challenge the cross-functional team to grow more sustainably and keep an eye on margin, because then that can sometimes get lost in the sea of other incentives. And they do that by not just by producing a large number of P&Ls and tables and numbers, but really by connecting the vision of the company, the strategy, action plans, and then KPIs that can be tracked. And from that, the company can make trade-offs, because every successful company has to make trade-offs. And how the FP&A team can help there is by proactively flagging risks and opportunities, and then use those insights to encourage leaders across the company to think differently, hopefully, right? And I have an example that a student of mine shared with me that I think speaks to this well. For context, I created a course called FP&A Bootcamp. I teach fundamental FP&A skills to finance teams and business leaders via Zoom. And in the workshop about planning and forecasting, we cover why it's so important to prioritize the process over just the P&L. One of my favorite quotes is from former US President Eisenhower. He said, "Plans are nothing, but planning is everything," right? So it's about the process, not just producing a set of numbers. And the example that the student shared, he was at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was a lot of uncertainty in this company. And in the past, they've done a budget that was very, very simple. The leaders would basically just say, "Oh, we think we should go for this revenue number." And there wasn't much analysis behind it. But there was so much uncertainty with COVID that the finance team had to come up with a better approach. And they ended up implementing what's called driver-based planning. So that means instead of planning at a high level, such as total revenues or even revenues by customer or by region, you discuss with your cross-functional team about what are the real drivers? What are the things that really make a difference in the business? So, it could be things, drivers like growth from expanding business with existing customers, or more leads from higher marketing investments, better customer retention, and also external factors, right? Like the COVID impact, or how competitors react to what we're doing. And so that for each of those drivers, they made a separate plan, and then they added all of them up. But what really made a difference was that they had a range for each of them. So what I mean with range is, for example, let's take, we want to get more leads from marketing. You have a low scenario, a medium, and a high scenario. And what that does is that helps the business to be more agile. It's not just a forecast on the paper that may or may not be right. Because in the end, actuals are always different from the forecast. So if, for example, results come in at the low end of the range, the team can plan ahead because they have the ranges, they have an idea of what could be possible outcomes. And that way you can just react to things happening much faster. And that was really, I think, where FP&A added a lot of value.
Wow. Okay. You covered a lot of ground there, Christian. So what I'm hearing from both of you is a little bit about the trade-offs, right? There's growth. And so you want to sustain that growth on the one hand, but you don't want it to go too crazy and then kind of go in the opposite direction. So you want FP&A to be keeping tabs on that. You want to be looking at the drivers of any kind of, weird thing that's happening in the world or in the industry, whether it's COVID or material, prices going up or down. And we kind of, just want to be looking at, the trade-offs of what everything that you're going to do has a cost. So what's that cost going to be, and is it worth the risk? Wow, that's really, really great answers. And now for the second question, we want to hear a little bit about obstacles to FP&A. So I'm going to ask the audience to tell us about their obstacles, and then we'll hear about it from Tasha and Christian as well. So I'm going to launch another poll. Okay, if you can tell us, what are the biggest obstacles that you've faced when it comes to FP&A? I'm very interested to see what obstacles people have faced. About a third of you have participated. Keep voting. I'm going to keep it open for a few more seconds. Seeing a lot of people are saying finding the right technology and not enough time. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Here are the results. So yeah, finding the right technology to help is a big one, and not enough time is a big one. Okay, so let's hear from you, Tasha and Christian. What are the biggest obstacles that you or your team have faced when it comes to implementing FP&A at a company? Tasha, let's start with you again.
Yeah, so I mean, there's such a wide variety of possible obstacles, but I'd say that the most important obstacle that I've faced is, putting together a very well thought out plan or forecast and bringing it to leadership. And by the way, this is at maybe every company I've done FP&A for. You bring it to leadership and they say, this isn't enough. We have to sell more. But a budget is a tool, forecast is a tool, and it strives to tell you a little bit about what the future could look like based on what has happened in the past. And so if leadership, isn't buying what you're selling, it doesn't matter, it almost doesn't matter what you submit if they're not willing to understand that, just because you want sales doesn't mean that you can just force your team to put that in the budget. That stuff doesn't happen without investment. It doesn't happen without careful planning, doesn't happen without resource allocation. And besides that, right, having good technology to support the process is paramount. Depending on what type of budget or forecast kind of, model you want to use. Right now in my areas, we are using zero-based budgeting. Most of what I'm looking at is just it's corporate SG&A expense. And so, it's very difficult, but is possible, just difficult if you're just using Excel without a tool that captures versioning and approvals and things like that, and consolidates for you once you upload it. It can be very, very difficult to find the time, especially during planning season or budget season. We know that, our hours are going to increase dramatically, the man hours, that are required to get that process taken care of, but you can't really hire for that your FP&A months. Your budgeting and forecasting might really require 42 people to get done, but the rest of the year you only need, 29. You can't carry those extra people. So it is very difficult to find time, and it's very difficult to basically stop everything you're doing, all the other projects that you're advising on, in order to just pay attention to budget. Unfortunately, that's what many FP&A professionals have to do. And I would say probably one that's sort of hidden is that I think it's very important for companies to have dedicated FP&A professionals and not just have accountants doing FP&A part-time. FP&A is, a real profession, and it's not something that we should just have people do in their spare time. So I would say, those three things together make it very difficult sometimes to get your work done.
Thanks, Tasha. Yeah, you touched on a lot of things. First of all, FP&A is a real profession. Yeah, I think that's I think we can all come away from this with that. But yeah, you touched on time and how those needs are elastic, right? In budgeting season, you're going to have a greater need for, more time, more resources, and also on leadership, on management buy-in, and making sure they understand what you're telling them, and can move on from there, and and create a plan based on that. And of course, the value of technology to kind of expand your capacity beyond the number of personnel that you have at any one point, which is probably going to be the amount you need not during budget season.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks, Tasha. What about you, Christian? What obstacles have you faced?
Yeah, I have an example of a project where we had a lot of obstacles. It goes a bit in the same direction as what Tasha mentioned. I was working as the marketing, finance, and analytics manager at Unilever, a large consumer goods company. And then I was in charge of, my team and I were in charge of managing the marketing budget for North America. Was a large budget, several $100 million. And when I joined, the entire budget was managed with 12 Excel spreadsheets, one for each marketing team, and each of those had 5 to 10 tabs. And my team had the task of consolidating all of that every month, right after month-end close, with a very short timeline, and it was completely manual. To consolidate that, they had to not just add all those files, link all those files, but also we had to make sure that the marketing team, the marketing analysts, didn't accidentally break anything with the formulas, because then, even if we do it correctly on our side, it still wouldn't give us the right number. Yeah. And so, I realized quickly that that's not a great way to manage budget. We need some help from technology to do this. And we looked to find for a solution. And even before we started to implement it, I already saw that there were lots of obstacles. One was that the CFO didn't really believe in it in the beginning. And so we weren't sure if we would be able to get the budget. And,
it goes back to that management buy-in issue.
Yeah. And then the other issue was that I could already tell that we would probably get some pushback from the marketing team, because they were very used to how things were run and how they're doing things. And they already thought that they're, spending way too much time on managing the budget, and they didn't want finance to come and tell them to learn a new process or do things differently. So there was a lot of obstacles to begin with.
Yeah, that's a good point. Collaboration with teams outside finance can definitely be a big obstacle. Okay. So now that we talked about obstacles, we want to talk a little bit about how to get around those obstacles. So I'm just going to launch another poll, and then we'll hear from you guys. Okay. What would most help you move forward with FP&A to get around some of these obstacles that we've been talking about? I see right now more guidance on best practices for FP&A is leading. Again, I'll leave it open for a couple more seconds. Yeah, it looks like that's the winner. Closing the poll. Yeah, most of you, a lot of you are saying more guidance and best practices for financial planning and analysis. So that's what we're here to talk about. Okay. So Tasha, why don't you tell us how you got over some of these obstacles and got started doing FP&A despite all these issues?
Well, despite all of those issues, I would say that you just have to jump in and start doing it. So like I said, a number of years ago, I was hired to help someone who didn't ever have any FP&A experience stand up an FP&A process for the entire company. And, just as Christian was saying, it was managed in Excel spreadsheets. But, one of the things that helped in the beginning was providing kind of standardized looks for the groups out there. So if I send a template, to a certain type of team, I make sure that the template makes sense. And by the way, you can do an entire budgeting process with only Excel. It can be done. It's not comfortable, and it's very prone to making errors, as Christian was saying. But I would say that, just get started doing something. And I would say that the best way to start is find raw data to play with. That is how I accidentally got started in FP&A and learned that I like analyzing data. FP&A isn't for everyone, just like any job. But for those people that like to dig around in data, organize data, it's not necessarily always clear the way that it should be organized when you first see it. But I would say just play with it, just like a Rubik's Cube, just move it around until you get a pattern, or, you find some kind of insight. They're there, but you have to look. But most recently, my most recent position, I was brought in to help professionalize the FP&A process. And again, we're doing the entire FP&A process for corporate in Excel currently, which doesn't really work for me. Now, we did that in the first few years that I was there, just to get something done. But as we saw with COVID and especially in the auto parts manufacturing kind of space in the economy, it's a very unusual time because there's a tremendous amount of pent up demand for automobiles and not enough microchips to go in cars. So despite the fact that people want cars, we can't necessarily, as an industry, produce the amount of cars that are currently needed. So, in order to be able to act more quickly, be more precise, and do some of that modeling that Christian was talking about, where you are, able to develop a range, it's really necessary to have a very good tool to do that. And so my company, in corporate FP&A, we're currently in the process of implementing Datarails. And Shoshana didn't know that when she asked me to join the panel today, but it is very difficult to do various versions of any budget or forecast without some kind of supporting technology. But I would say that something is better than nothing. If you can get technology, you don't have to implement anything that takes years and an army of people to implement. And that was what was awesome about Datarails for me, is that it takes a very, a relatively small amount of people and a small amount of time to implement properly. And so next year we'll be able to, do different versions, high, medium, and low, different scenario planning that we just did not have the capacity to do in prior years.
Awesome. Thanks, Tasha. Yeah, I like what you're saying about just dig in, right? Even if you don't start off having all the tools you need, that can be okay. That's okay. You have Excel. Like
crawl, walk, run.
Crawl. Yeah, exactly. Crawl before you walk before you run. Start digging into the numbers. Okay, Christian, what about you? How have you overcome some of those obstacles?
Yeah, so we were at the stage where we knew, we had to get help in terms of implementing a tool to help with those 12 Excel files that we had to consolidate every month. And the challenge was that the CFO didn't really see the value at the beginning. The way I originally sold it is, look, we're going to save hours of time for my team, which we can spend on, doing more business partnering and more strategic tasks and driving the business forward. And somehow he wasn't seeing it. And so I discussed this with other finance managers, and brainstormed, okay, what really, of all the benefits that this tool will bring, what is most important to him? And what I then thought is, okay, maybe it's not the time saving, but maybe it's more about controls, because if you have a tool that supplements Excel, you can avoid making mistakes that may make it into the forecast. You have an ability to have an audit trail, where you can look at what happened to that number, who made a change, when was it changed, and that just the way then we explained it is, look, we had in the past, we had all these near misses, where we found a mistake that we made or that the marketing team made just in time, before we submitted a forecast. But you can't be sure that we'll always be able to find all those mistakes. So to improve financial controls, it would really make sense to implement this solution. And that's what sold him right away, that worked out really well.
Yeah, that's such a good point with the data integrity. It's so valuable for every company. And just to point that out, that as a way of overcoming any reluctance on the part of management. Yeah. Christian, was there something you wanted to add, or should we move on to the next question?
I just wanted, so the other challenge I mentioned earlier, was that the marketing team wasn't really excited about it at the beginning, right? They didn't want to change their processes, and they didn't want to spend time into learning something new. And so what ended up I talked to a lot of the marketing managers and tried to find out, what were their concerns. And what I realized is that there were in particular two managers who were completely against it. They thought, they already have enough on their plate, they can't do something else. And what I ended up achieving was I asked them if they wanted to join the implementation team and have a seat at the table and share their concerns and, see better, what the tool can do and help shape it in a way that it would really, speak to their concerns. And that made a huge difference because they felt empowered, they felt that their voice was heard, and they ended up being some of the biggest supporters of the implementation of the tool and shared it, with their colleagues and the marketing team. And in the end, we had a great rollout. That was, I think, 4 years ago now, and they're still using the system and are happy apparently. So it was a big success in the end.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, those are some really good ways to overcome that kind of reluctance on the part of whether management or other teams. Great tips. And now we're going to get to our last question for now before we move on to the audience questions. So I'm going to launch one more poll. This is going to be the simplest poll for you to answer because it's factual. It's just going to ask about your job title, because we then Tasha and Christian are going to address their answers to different types of roles. So we wanted to see what kind of roles people here have. I'm seeing a lot of FP&A roles. Makes sense. A few CFO, VP Finance, Finance Director roles, about a third, a little less. And some controller and other finance roles. Okay, I'm gonna keep it open for a few more seconds. Okay. Here are the results. So yeah, 43% FP&A analyst, manager, or director, and 28% CFO, VP Finance, Finance Director. Okay, great. All right, so Tasha, if you could give one piece of advice to anyone in the corporate finance world who wants to do more FP&A, whether themselves or their teams, but maybe facing some obstacles like we just talked about and isn't sure where to start, what would be your advice to them? And how would it be different if they're early career, mid-career, or if they're a controller versus a CFO versus someone in an FP&A role? What do you think?
So I'll address it to the beginners. Get comfortable with data and learn as much about how to shape and control data as you can. It's something that wasn't necessarily available to me when I was younger and in my training, and certainly not in college, right? There's a lot of programs that you can get into to learn accounting. I don't know of any programs that you can get into to learn FP&A in a traditional four-year college. Maybe they're out there. I hope they are. But what usually ends up happening, or at least in my experience, is someone on the accounting team gets roped into, coming up with some kind of ad hoc analysis for whoever's asking, and they find out that they love manipulating data in Excel, right? That's the tool that the majority of us get started on. I would say, learn Excel right away, because that's kind of a gateway into other data visualization tools and programming languages. And I would say, take Christian's bootcamp, go on LinkedIn Learning. There are resources out there. They're just not the traditional resources that we're used to talking about or hearing about, but they're out there. And I would say also, LinkedIn is an amazing resource for just going and finding other people with the title that you want. Go talk to them and find out how they got started. Ask, oh gosh, this is my favorite one. Crank on Excel with other people, get around a table or, get on a Zoom call and watch each other manipulate data, because you will accidentally see something that you've never seen before. You'll ask them how to do it and they'll teach you. And pretty soon, you'll be bopping around Excel. That's what I would say to beginners. I'll let Christian take, managers and hire.
Yeah, amazing, Tasha. Thanks. So get comfortable with data. That's awesome. And get comfortable with Excel and start networking. I saw there was a networking thread going on over here in the chat. People are putting in their LinkedIn. So yeah, awesome. Okay, Christian, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, thank you, Tasha, for recommending my course, FP&A Bootcamp. I'm happy I have some advice for senior leaders and CFOs. So if your company has never done FP&A before, it can be tough to convince the cross-functional team that there's a value in it, right? So that's one of the big challenges I've seen. And the thing is that it doesn't really make sense to invest time and resources into FP&A processes if it's just a finance exercise. If you're building a forecast or a budget, it doesn't really add much value if it doesn't include detailed assumptions on business drivers. And for that, you need to get engagement with, your sales team, the marketing team, product team, R&D team, etc. And I've gotten pushback in the past. For example, the sales team said that they're supposed to be selling and they don't have time to do all these FP&A work, like helping with the forecast and such. So what I recommend you do is you need to start with implementing something that where other departments immediately see the value and where that helps them. So one thing that worked for me was recommending starting by trying to give them more flexibility around budgets, right? So traditionally, companies that don't have a full-fledged FP&A process, they may set a budget at the beginning of the year, and then people just have to manage with that. But instead, I would tell people, look, we're happy to give you more flexibility. You're happy to spend more or less than the budget, but we just need two things from you. You need to tell us early enough about the change. It can't be a last minute thing. And the second one is you have to give us an idea of what the impact is of that investment. What will the result be on the business? And that then allows us to do two things. So we can, because they're telling us things earlier, we can create a forecast based on that. It just appears naturally. You don't even have to give them more work to do. And the other thing is, if they tell you what they think the result is of a change in the budget, then we can do financial analysis around it. We can run an ROI model or a discounted cash flow model and get a better idea of what the actual impact is on the financials from that. And and so giving budget flexibility and in turn receiving buy-in on the forecast and financial analysis process, that can really kickstart an FP&A process and set you up for success.
Okay, amazing. Thanks, Christian. Thanks both of you, Christian and Tasha. Now we're gonna move over to some of the audience questions. There's a lot of questions, so we may not get to everyone, but we're gonna try, we're gonna get started. Okay, we have one question about optimizing the process of looking at budgets versus actuals. Christian, do you wanna take that? Do you have any recommendations for optimizing the process of looking at budgets versus actuals?
Sure. So the key thing is that you don't want to spend a lot of time in getting the data, combining the data, crunching the numbers, because the value of comparing budget versus actuals really is from finding root causes and insights that can result in risks and opportunities, right? So you need to make sure you have enough time to talk to your business partners and ask, why are the numbers the way they are? And don't stop asking that question until you come to a real insight. How do you know you come to a real insight? That's when there's an action that's implied by it, right? So an example I always give people is we have lower revenue because 10 customers ordered less. That's not a root cause, and it shouldn't be enough, as an analysis result when you look at actual versus budget. But if you say something like, oh, we had lower revenue because our website converted fewer leads into paying customers, then that's a real insight, because then there's the next step is immediately clear, and you can look at, okay, what's wrong with the website? How do we fix the website?
Okay, great. Okay, let's see. I saw a question about how do you approach and evaluate when is the time to scale a current FP&A model or infrastructure to a more in-depth level? Who wants to take that one?
I can take it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's right now. right now is the time. Right?
Right now is the time. Okay.
Right now is the time. I've worked for quite a few companies that take the zero-based budgeting approach. And I think that might be what the person asking is referring to, right? It's not enough to just summarize your data and carry out trends. It can work, right? It can if you don't have access to, talking to the business, that can work. But a budget is pointless unless you are involving the people that know what the numbers mean and know how to change the numbers, drive the numbers up, drive the numbers down. Don Clark here asked a question. Hi, Don. I found moving beyond budgets and forecast to partner with business functional teams is where FP&A can have the most impact to the company. What have I experienced with this approach? I would say that a budget is just a pointless FP&A exercise if you're not talking to the business leaders. That is where the budget begins. It does not begin with finance. It might begin by sharing some insights with them about former trends or what you're seeing for the past few quarters, seasonality, if you're able to detect things like that they haven't. But you need to talk to the business owners about what's going on right now, what is changing right now, what would they like to see change right now, and then figure out how you're going to, change the way that you're currently operating your business to get to that result. Do you need to hire people? Do you need to implement a system? Do you need to increase your marketing budget, etc.? Right? Just like Christian was talking about, driver based. So, that's what I would say. The time is now. Do it.
Awesome. Now we've got a question. Someone is interested in learning about implementing budget and forecast processes from scratch at a startup. Christian, maybe from your Squarespace experience, you can have something that you want to say about starting from scratch for budgeting and forecasting.
Yeah, what's important when you start from scratch is that you set the process up in a way that it doesn't, you have to find a balance between involving the business and the business partners, while at the same time not tying the entire company down for extended period of time or for weeks and weeks at a time, because then you quickly lose people and they will see budget and planning as just another exercise that takes too much time. Right. So what's really important is to plan out the entire process ahead of time. I always divide budget process in 5 phases. We probably don't have time to talk about all of this. I have an entire workshop in my bootcamp where we talk about this in detail. But essentially, what I can tell you now is that think about how you communicate everything, because oftentimes budgeting falls apart because deadlines aren't communicated and people feel out of touch and they feel like they gave inputs weeks ago, but then they haven't heard back. And make sure that you get feedback from executives quickly and timely, because that's often also what happens if there's not enough communication and not enough clarifying the process up front. That sometimes takes a long time, and then assumptions may have changed already, and then you're just playing catch up. So that's some of the big things to think about when you're first starting out.
Yeah, can I add to that?
Sure.
Start with a blank Excel spreadsheet and get together with your business leaders and write down all of the people that work for you and their salaries and how much it costs to employ them, and all of the outside expenses that you already have and you already pay, and anything that you think that you will begin to pay next year. Just put it all on a spreadsheet. Make sure you understand who owns which expense or controls which cost. And that's it. Sit down with all the people that control costs and write down all of those things and how much you think you'll spend for the month. You can layer in things like inflation, if that helps. You can layer in things like merit increases, you can layer in things like promotions, you can plan those things, if you're going to set up a new team, you'll have to make sure that you account for, costs like recruiting. There's little hidden expenses that people don't always think about, but the easiest way to do it is just sit down. The finance person sits down with the business person and guides them through making sure everything that they're going to spend or want to spend is accounted for, right? You put all of that together and you bring it to your executive, right? And then your executive can bless it. You can talk about your strategic vision during that time, right? Where you're basically justifying all of the items that you've listed. I need these new people in Q3 because of this. I don't need this type of software anymore after this date. I need this, and it costs this much more. It costs this much to implement. This is how long it takes to implement. All of those things come together and equal a budget. It's
Great.
not as hard as it sounds.
But
it does sound scary to most
Yeah.
people, right? And it sounds super scary to non-finance people. I would say that as an FP&A person, one of your most important responsibilities is figuring out how to communicate what you need to communicate in layman's terms. If you start firing jargon and finance buzzwords and everything, people tune out or they get embarrassed to ask you what that means because they don't know. You need to turn it into English and teach them those terms and jargon along the way so that they can have an intelligent conversation with your executive, because your executive already knows those words. I would say, start there.
I think that's such a great point, because when you're trying to get that buy-in from whether it's from the other teams or from the management, you want to be sure that you're talking the same language and that you're explaining it, like you said, in layman's terms, so that it's not just like finance jargon. It's something where they can see the value. And I think we have time for one more question from Natalie. She's asking, what should you consider when evaluating different FP&A software options? She wrote, I've always worked at companies where the FP&A solution is in place, so I've had to adapt to the existing solution, and going through the process to select a new software and transition from Google Sheets. And there are a lot of options out there at different price points. Tasha, you want to start? And then Christian, if you have anything to add to it.
Yeah, so here's my plug for Datarails. There's a lot of different systems that you can implement. The things that I was looking for was, were low cost, short implementation time. And with Datarails, the majority of the manipulation can be done if you know how to use Excel. So the important thing is usability for me. And, when I heard that if you understand how to use Excel, you understand how to use Datarails, that was extremely important to me. Again, buy-in. If I needed to go to my leaders and say, okay, I need, hundreds of thousands of dollars, I need 20 extra people, and I need a year to get this done, that doesn't go over as well as, I need, a much smaller amount of money. I can do the implementation myself, and I don't need anyone. I don't need an administrator going forward. The administrator is me. Or, I think of it also as a good way to break in or, teach the younger FP&A generation. There's not enough people on the bench right now. That could be a good first foray into a finance system, because it is very easy to use. You don't need to know any programming languages. I would say keep it simple. Keep it simple, and also find a team that you want to work with for implementation. Because they are going to make or break, they're going to make or break the way that your system runs when you get it set up. Make sure that, your style is compatible, and that, you have an easy time working together, because you're going to be working together for the next however many weeks. And now there's eyes on you, and you need to make sure that you're successful. Because if you've gone to your executives, for permission to install a system and then it goes badly, you just don't want to do that. You just want to make sure that you have a very good team to support you, you know, at Datarails, and I happen to. So.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so that's a few good points. A good team to support you.
Yeah.
Start with something that you know. If you know Excel, you know how to use it. Usability and cost and implementation time. And Christian, what did you want to add about that?
Yeah, so a high-level decision you need to make before choosing a tool is, do you want to replace Excel, you know, get out of Excel, or do you want to build on top of it, you know, and expand the functionality of Excel? And it's a big debate, you know, between FP&A experts. Some argue, you know, Excel is 60 years old and, you know, it's time that it gets replaced. But I firmly believe that Excel will stay and it will not go away because it's just so easy to use. You know, anyone knows how to use Excel. And even if they're not great at Excel yet, today there's such great resources out there, you know, on YouTube. They're fantastic, free, they're high quality, they teach you how to use Excel. And it's super flexible, right? It can do anything you want. And so, yeah, I would firmly argue look for a tool that builds on top of Excel, you know, that allows you to keep using what you're used to, because then you'll save so much stress down the line with, you have to teach people, you don't have to teach people another tool. You don't have to, you know, track how many people are using the tool because they just stay in Excel. And I also realized when I implemented other software earlier that people sometimes, it's really hard to get people off of Excel. You know, even if they realize that, oh, maybe this other thing is better, they just go back to their offline reports, and then you're duplicating work. So that's why I would always argue for looking for a tool, you know, like Datarails that allows you to stay in Excel.
Such a good point to really think about what are you already working with and building on that. Okay. Let's just close off with one final question. If you can answer in like one sentence, what was your biggest influence on your path towards FP&A, Tasha?
Oh my goodness. So I had a mentor early on in my career, like around the analyst level, that her life's dream was to become the division vice president of FP&A, and I didn't even necessarily know what that meant. So I started, you know, nosing around because I wanted, she and I are alike in a lot of ways, you know, in terms of personality. So I thought, you know, this lady is very successful and dynamic. I need to see, you know, what if this is a person that, you know, I look up to and this is her goal, I want to see what that's all about. And I realized that I'm very good with manipulating data, and I'm very good at teaching. And a lot of what you do in FP&A is you kind of act as the bridge between finance and the rest of the business people. And so I love you know, supporting the organization that way, right? Because if FP&A is done well, it can be really impactful. And you know, throughout the years of kind of climbing the ladder, I've kind of gone between FP&A and finance systems. Those are kind of my two specialties, like when I'm in the consulting world. And I just love it. It gives me so much joy to add to the company's success that I'm just addicted. I keep coming back to FP&A.
Awesome. Christian, one sentence, what was your biggest influence?
My biggest influence, and it's really tough to do this in one sentence.
I know, sorry, I did like 50 sentences.
My biggest influence was, one of my biggest influences was the head of sales in my first role out of college, where I was working in sales finance. And, you know, I had a tough time in the beginning because there's so much that I didn't teach at university about FP&A. And one evening he walked over to my desk and I was, you know, scared that did I forget to send him something? Did I make a mistake in my report? And he just sat down with me and he said, look, it's a process. Whenever you step out of your comfort zone grows a little bit. And things that seem really difficult now will be a lot easier tomorrow. And I first didn't get it, but that And that once I realized what he meant, it really stuck with me. And I realized that if I just keep challenging myself a little bit, accepting the big doing a presentation in front of this big meeting, or, doing this report that I've never done before, then I just keep growing, and things kept getting easier. And that was super motivating throughout my entire career, actually.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. Okay, so I've put some links in the chat. If people want to follow up, Christian's course is FP&A Bootcamp. We will be sending out the recording of this afterwards. And there's going to be a survey at the very end as you leave. If you can just take 2 seconds to fill out the survey, that would be great. Tasha and Christian, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. It's been really exciting, and it was great having you. And thank you everyone for joining us. So have a great rest of your day. Bye.